So this is going to be kind of difficult because there's so much ground to cover. I mean, I'm on the wiki page. Look at how long this is. Pellaeon had quite a life. The fact that he died of assassination at the age of 92 while commanding a battle, I think says something about him and about the kind of the story we're going to tell. Pellaeon's interesting because, in contrast to the other imperial leaders we see throughout the series, with the possible exception of Thrawn, he just kind of really breaks the trend. Let's look at like kind of the archetype is incompetent sociopathic sadists, be it Isard, be it Dala, be it Palpatine, be it Vader, be it Zinj. We have this long line of people who are basically very inept when you actually look at it. They might be terrifying, they might have great amounts of power, but they're utterly really bad at what they do. And the only reason they're in their position is because they happen to have fallen, or in Palpatine's place, manipulated himself into a position in which his rule is unquestioned. But I mean, when we're talking about Palpatine, think about it for a minute. The Galactic Republic lasted for 10,000 years and was only ended because of an external threat. His empire lasted, what, like 17 years and completely imploded upon his death. Now, I know that was deliberate, but I repeat my point. If your goal is to deliberately set up your empire to collapse upon your death, that doesn't speak volumes about your competency. But anyways, amidst the just the mass of sociopathy, sadism, incompetence, we have Pellaeon, who's kind of stands there like in the eye of the storm. He's just kind of there. He's the steady figure. It's interesting because the TV tropes page calls him the Watson to Thrawn's Sherlock Holmes, which is even funnier when you think about it, because Watson's older than Holmes and has a mustache, and Grand Admiral Thrawn was in part based on Sherlock Holmes. So that probably is what Timothy Zahn actually had in mind. But yeah, he was the Watson. He was the second in command to pretty much everybody. And kind of what Pellaeon's story is, it's a story of him bouncing from one inept leader to another inept leader, being disgusted by them over and over again, being incapable of finding anyone worth serving, and eventually at the end being given leadership by Dala, realizing that there was no one left for him to serve and that everybody who had come before him had failed spectacularly, and that all that was left was for him to take power and to do it himself. And once again, we're going to go into more detail, but ultimately Pellaeon would succeed beyond the wildest dreams of any of his predecessors, even Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was really the only competent person to emerge post the death of the Emperor. But he, like I said, even though I guess Thrawn's career ended in assassination, Pellaeon succeeded where Thrawn didn't, and was able to have an advantageous peace with the New Republic, rebuild the Imperial remnant, and eventually, once it became a monarchy again, it would become the dominant galactic power, all based on the legacy of Pellaeon and what he had built up during his time as the leader. So you kind of have this fascinating story of a man who was always the second in command, who just viewed it as his life's duty to serve, suddenly kind of eventually being that leader and realizing he had to take on the mantle, because all along he was the one with the talent, he was the one with kind of the skill to do it. It also kind of reminds me of something Frank Herbert would like to say, which was, power doesn't corrupt, but power attracts the corrupt. That is, if you take somebody who's basically a decent and honorable person and give them power, it won't corrupt them, but the mosquitoes are drawn to power, well, like mosquitoes are drawn to anything with blood in it, and suck it out. So, that being said, now that we've kind of got the introduction away, let's talk a bit about Gilad Pellaeon. So Pellaeon was from Coruscant. He was born 50 years before the Battle of Yavin. So 50 years before A New Hope. And when he was 15 years old, he hired a slicer to fake his birth certificate so he could get into the Imperial Academy. That was how desperate he was to join the Navy. He would go on to serve, God, nearly, okay, if he was 92 when he died and he joined the Navy at 15, he served in the Navy for 77 years. Wow, that is quite the service span. I wonder if any other human in galactic history had a military career as long as his. But yeah, so he joined. He did well in the Imperial Academy, as kind of per what his personality prior to assuming leadership of the Remnant. He graduated in the top third. He did well in the academy, but didn't exactly stand out. He eventually joined the Republic Judicial Forces, which was kind of the rump military the Republic had before the Military Creation Act. Tarkin also, at least in the reboot, served within the Judicial Forces. And kind of some of the more notable commanders from the Imperial era started their careers there. So he served within the Judicial Forces, and eventually he became he was given during the Clone Wars the captaincy of an Acclaimer class assault ship. Now, while he was captain of the ship, eventually the ship would kind of become special. They put a bunch of I think it was unique concussion missiles on it. So while he was on the ship, there was kind of a crossover where he got to meet Anakin and Ashoka. It's and Rex as well. It's pretty funny. Let me see if I can find the quote where he thought patrols Ashoka. Let's see here. Good grief, Skywalker. Good grief, Rex. Doesn't Skywalker tell his underling to put clothes on? What does she think this is, a cruise liner? Gilad Pellaeon about Ashoka Tano's inappropriate choice of clothing. So here is what he thought patrols her. We do not expose flesh in this ship, not only because it's unbecoming, undisciplined, and distracting, but because the ship is a dangerous place. Sharp edges, noxious chemicals, hot exhausts, weapons flash, safety first, Padawan, cover up. So, yeah, he thought patrolled Ashoka and was like, on my ship, you dress in a uniform and you don't dress in skimpy clothing. It's distracting for the men. Also, you're too young to be in skimpy clothing. So, yeah, it's interesting. During this time period, Pellaeon, I think, kind of at some point decided that he was married to the Navy. While he had a reputation, interestingly enough, as a womanizer, which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of him, I think it's the mustache. Chicks dig the mustache. He did have at least 2 illegitimate children, probably more, one of whom I think would go on to win the imperial elections and become head of state. So that's pretty badass, but he never married because he was married to the fleet and he was father to his men. And because of that, he just didn't want to do anything other than to be in the Navy. Although, like I said, women threw themselves at him because of the uniform and the mustache. So when the Republic became the Empire, he was transferred to Chimera, which was one of the first Imperial-class Star Destroyers to be built, serving as second in command and eventually becoming its captain. So what's kind of notable throughout his career, and we really see this once we get into the Empire, is Pellaeon was very well respected. He didn't really get promoted further than captain, but he was very popular with the other captains. He was regarded as having one of the best run Star Destroyers in the fleet, as being a man of impeccable discipline, honor, and professionalism. Professionalism was very important to him. He really didn't like hurting civilians or slavery or a lot of kind of the sadistic things the Empire did. While he was utterly loyal to it, viewing it as the legitimate government of the galaxy, which is fair enough, He was uncomfortable with a lot of things, particularly towards the end of Palpatine's reign. He did. So, kind of where Pellaeon enters into kind of the more familiar timeline is the Chimera was designated the backup command vessel during the Battle of Endor. That is, if the if the Executor was to be destroyed or forced to leave, then the Chimera would be where Vader would transfer his flag and where command would be transferred to. Yeah. So when the Executor blew up and crashed into the Death Star, the Chimera got hit by an ion cannon blast that caused a conduit to blow up and killed the admiral who was going to take over. So Pellaeon decided that, well, this battle is turned into a complete disaster. The rebels were just starting to mow down the remaining Star Destroyers, and they were in a state of complete confusion with the death of the Emperor and the loss of his battle meditation. So Pellaeon famously ordered the retreat, and they went back. So all the ships got together and flew back, and he tried to keep the fleet together and suggested that they go back, get reinforcements, go back and defeat the Republic fleet while it was still at Endor. But that idea was shot down. So he was able to remain captain of the Chimera, and he remained. It's interesting because, well, Isard never promoted him to admiral. He kind of functionally held the rank of admiral because he was so respected and trusted by the other captains. He was given kind of a leadership role despite not actually outranking a lot of the people he basically led. Why Isard didn't promote him, we aren't really sure. My guess is she was just concerned that he was too popular in contrast to her, who was universally hated. So even though he thought, like most people, that Isard was an incompetent sociopath, Pellaeon considered to serve her because he viewed her as the most legitimate surviving Imperial, as she controlled Coruscant. And there was some sort of line of succession. She had killed Saint Pestige and the Imperial Rule Council, and so he regarded her as probably the closest thing there was to a leader at that point in time. So we don't know a ton of what happened after Isard died. Pellaeon bounced from warlord to warlord, military commander to military commander, trying as much as possible to keep fighting the now emergent New Republic. He hated it though. It was very unpleasant. Pellaeon kind of felt it was his duty to die in battle. I think throughout his life, and there's a very poignant quote up here. It's been a long road, sir, long and hard and discouraging for all of us, but mostly for you. I think there was a desire throughout his life to just let himself die, to in one of these battles go down in a blaze of glory, just because he couldn't really take what the galaxy had become after Palpatine, after the repeated failures. But, I mean, if you've served under Dala, Palpatine, and Isard, it's kind of hard not to get discouraged. However, salvation was going to come for Pellaeon, albeit briefly. So while he was kind of bouncing around from warlord to warlord, etc., I'm not really sure if he had more than just the Chimera under his leadership at this point. Once again, though, people always respected him because he was so selfless. He, despite being popular and a very competent military commander, he never attempted to carve out his own dominion. He never saw himself as a leader, probably which is partially what made him so great when they fucking gave him supreme command of the Imperial Remnant, because, well, he didn't really have the power-grubbing sociopathy of his rivals. So we enter Thrawn. So when Thrawn was returning from the unknown regions, he identified Pellaeon as being one of the possible allies for him, someone who would welcome his return, and welcome him he did. For the first time in years, Pellaeon began to feel some hope. While he was a bit taken aback to find out that Thrawn was a Chiss, he quickly came to accept him. If for no other reason than Thrawn was a Grand Admiral, he had an official rank, and his rank was validly been given. Regardless of how Pellaeon felt about the Emperor, he did regard him as having been the legitimate ruler of the galaxy, and thus if Thrawn was made a Grand Admiral from him, then he was the logical choice to lead the Empire. But, I mean, the thing you have to understand is within the Empire, human supremacy was very common. Pellaeon kind of, I guess you could say, he wasn't a particularly like strong human supremacist. He just kind of had absorbed those attitudes. So he kind of felt uncomfortable around Thrawn. But when Thrawn proved himself, he immediately took to him. Now, what's kind of interesting about this relationship is Pellaeon was probably older than Thrawn. So it's kind of that old, once again, the Watson to his Sherlock Holmes type of thing. So Pellaeon was regarded as being a very good strategist and tactician, but not being particularly creative. Not in the same way like Akbar or Garmbel Iblis or Thrawn were. But once again, to be fair, given what a dumpster fire pretty much everyone else in the Imperial Navy is, being able to just command in a competent fashion is pretty good. However, interestingly, despite being at that point in time like 60 years old, yeah, I guess he would be like 60 something at that time, he did completely change his command style. Thrawn started to teach him how to use his tricks, like how to psychoanalyze his opponents, how to do like four-dimensional chess and all that kind of stuff. And later on, it would show that he grew immensely as a commander. So that's kind of another interesting thing. Despite being at an age where a lot of people would have started to consider retiring, he had kind of completely overhauled and learned a whole bunch of new tricks, etc. So Thrawn and him kind of had a bromance going on. So Thrawn took over the Chimera as his flagship, and Pellaeon remained commander of it, basically being Thrawn's second in command, despite only being a captain and Thrawn being a Grand Admiral. So this is kind of referenced. Eli Vanto is kind of the new Pellaeon, if you've read the reboot book Thrawn, because he kind of is the person of great talents who's very humble and self-effacing, but who Thrawn sees talent in where a lot of people don't. So Pellaeon served under Thrawn. He kind of refers to him as he kind of hero worshipped him because Thrawn was not a sociopath. He was personally brave. He tended to lead from the front. He treated his men with respect, and they loved him because of his talent and his leadership. So Pellaeon was just a protege of Thrawn. He had a lot of faith in him. And when Thrawn wound up dying, it sent him almost into a suicidal depression. He took his fleet to the edge of the galaxy, and he was about to just launch a full-out assault on the New Republic and go out in a blaze of glory. But cooler heads prevailed, and he went on to join the Pterodok brothers in the Greater Moldred. Now, if you haven't heard of what that is before in Legends, I don't blame you. It was the strongest post-Thrawn warlord faction, which was ruled over by the Pterodok brothers, who were kind of two fat, sociopathic people who were slightly less incompetent than everyone else. So Pellaeon had to serve under them, and he despised them because he thought that they were power-grubbing, weak, self-indulgent, cowardly men who had no ability to lead. And in that, he was 100% correct. So, yeah, things were kind of really bad for him, and once again, he kind of went back into a depression. However, they did give him command of Crimson Command, which I think was like 50 or 60 Victory class Star Destroyers. So, I mean, like, I don't get it. They didn't promote him, but he was commanding like an entire fleet. Once again, that's kind of part of the irony of his career. So that all happened, and then Fleet Admiral Dalla emerged. Now, as we all know, Fleet Admiral Dalla is probably the most incompetent Imperial commander, and that is saying a lot, considering how much everybody else sucked. But she showed up, and she at least, the one thing you can say to her is she never lost sight of who the real enemy was. She hated the infighting between the warlords more than anybody. She utterly despised it. And so she went to Pellaeon and asked him for her help. Sorry, him to help her reunite the warlords. So he defected to her side and agreed. So they had a conference where he used all of his credibility to get the 13 most powerful deep core warlords to come. And they had a conference between them where they were asked to elect a new emperor from their midst. And they just started arguing, bickering for 3 hours. One of them tried to leave, and Dalla locked the doors until they picked a new leader. Eventually, I think it came to blows. So I think Pellaeon beat the crap out of one of them. But Dalla had enough of it, and she hit a button, and nerve gas came in and killed everybody. She liked Gil though, so she gave him a breathing mask. So that being accomplished, Dalla's record of utter failure wound up, for once in her life, helping out. Because the peace conference went so poorly, the empire was now unified under her command. So she carried out her campaign, her second campaign. Her first campaign had resulted in her losing 80% of her fleet, getting the Maw destroyed, and succeeding only in killing 50 defenseless colonists. Yeah, if you want to read those books, they're hilarious. So she launched a new offensive against the New Republic and completely and utterly failed. To put into context how much she sucked, one of the deep core warlords had built a stealth superstar destroyer. Yes, a 12-kilometer long behemoth with stealth plating on it, and she lost that due to her own incompetence. So after she lost that and they got really badly beat up, Dalla had self-awareness for once in her life and was like, God, I really suck at this. I'm going to go leave, guys. I'll be back later, though. Her constantly coming back would be a thorn in Pellaeon's side, as just about every time things were going okay, she'd come back and ruin them. So she promoted him to admiral and left. And she's like, you're going to have to take over the empire now. These guys have no idea what the hell they're doing, including me. So, like I said, this is kind of where we are now. We've had a guy who's served, what are we at, 5 or 6 commanders, all of whom, with the exception of Thrawn, were utterly incompetent sociopaths. And in Thrawn's case, Thrawn died. So, I mean, you can say it wasn't his fault that he got assassinated, although I have my own theory that Palpatine assassinated him to prevent him from winning. I think he let Thrawn basically get things in motion and then had him assassinated, because otherwise his death is just too lame, and I just can't handle that. But yeah, he failed, so it was up to him to lead the Empire. So almost immediately, Pellaeon decided the Deep Core was not going to work out, so he took all the remaining forces out to the Outer Rim, annexed the Pentastar alignment, and set up what we know today as the Imperial Remnant. He managed to unite pretty much everything except for the rump stayed in the Deep Core. So he immediately, after reorganizing the Imperial fleet, launched a series of offensives in the Orinda campaign and actually managed to beat the New Republic. Now, it wasn't decisive or anything, but he was able to take a bunch of border regions and establish, like I said, a secure, fortified border. He was able to stabilize Imperial space, etc. So after that, it kind of settled into a stalemate where neither side was really willing to launch a full-scale offensive against the other. Obviously, his position was a lot worse, but kind of under his leadership, things started to turn around. Slavery was banned, explicit anti-alien sentiments were restricted, which is something I agree with, because if you're going to have a galaxy that's majority non-human, you can't treat them as slaves. Now, certainly within the Fel Empire and within Pellaeon's remnant, it was human centric, but a lot like the blatant enslavement of non-humans finally ended, which I think is to his credit as is abolishing slavery. So under his leadership, they started to rebuild their army and economy, and his rule was basically, like I said, professional, not sociopathic and competent, which is good in a leader. So, like I said, he just focused on good government, organization, trying to make the new order palatable to the public. So things were actually working very well. He was extremely popular with the Navy, with the civilian population, etc. And some were beginning to wonder if maybe it was time to seek a peace treaty, kind of a peace with honor thing. The empire was very badly beaten up, but it wasn't completely dead. It could still pose a threat to the new republic. So why not do a peace treaty now and end on a high note? You could always rebuild and come back later on. However, what wound up happening is Dala happened. Dala approached the Moths, and the Moths were like, we can totally win this war, guys. We're just going to have to launch a full-out offensive, and it's all going to work out. And Pellaeon's like, no, that sounds like a really bad idea. We have nowhere near the number of forces to do this. All we're going to do is lose what little bargaining power we have left, and the New Republic's going to completely annihilate us. And Dala's like, no, I can't lose. I've never failed before. And Pellaeon's like, you failed literally every military campaign you've ever led. And she's like, I can't hear you. So she went to the Deep Core and got a bunch of just random warlords there, and they launched their offensive. And Pellaeon just kind of sighed and took his own navy. He's like, look, I'm going to have to try to win a couple token victories and hopefully seek a peace treaty. So, because the Moths and Dala basically forced his hand. I believe he described the entire thing as being madness, not Sparta. So, that whole war went really, really poorly. Pellaeon actually was winning on his front, whereas Dala lost the first battle, her entire fleet got destroyed, and then the New Republic could bring all their forces to bear on him, and he got annihilated. The Imperial Remnant was reduced to 8 sectors, and those 8 sectors were growing smaller by a day. So what wound up happening in the aftermath of that was... that was Pellaeon came to accept that the Empire was beaten and it was time to start discussing their terms of surrender. So I'm not going to go in through all the minutiae of what happened during that period. He had definitely become a much, much better commander, probably the best general fleet commander in the galaxy, with the possible exception of Akbar or Bel-Iblis. Interestingly, he said that he would only surrender to Bel-Iblis because he was another military man and someone he respected immensely. He said there's no harm in being beaten by him. I'm not going to surrender to some bureaucrat, though. So, a bunch of things happened. There was this conspiracy involving a con artist named Flim to try to pretend that Grand Admiral Thrawn had come back. The Moff still thought they could win a war. He wound up stopping all of it, and the Kamas document crisis happened, which I won't bore you with, but because it's complicated and I didn't think it was that interesting. Basically, the New Republic was having a political crisis because one of the leading races thought that the Bothans had been complicit in the genocide of their planet because of an incomplete copy of a document. Pellaeon, however, offered a complete copy of the document proving that it was actually Palpatine who was behind it as part of a negotiation deal. So he managed to crack down on the hardliners and negotiated the Galactic Concordance, or the Pellaeon Gavris, I can never pronounce his name, treaty. So the final treaty was the brainchild of. So the treaty was actually much, much better than anyone could hope for. They didn't require, the empire didn't have to surrender. It put forth terms that what was left of the Galactic Empire would retain its independence, but an end of hostilities would occur. Also, there would be free trade between the two, and that governments were able to pick which other side they wanted to be part of. So a lot of worlds had been trapped within New Republic space that were fortified, so they were able to reestablish contact with the rest of it. Some other human majority worlds also wanted to rejoin the Empire. So once again, we have a guy who came out of a really, really bad situation and kind of made the best of it. Because the whole thing was going to be a disaster. They were facing extinction, but they were able to come out with peace with honor. So after that, Pellaeon's career, he would go on to continue to rule the Imperial Remnant for most of the rest of his life. He would bring them into an alliance with the New Republic during the Yuzon Vong War, and eventually lead the Imperial Remnant in as one of the component parts of the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, essentially allying the two longtime rivals. He always had a lot of respect for the Jedi in particular and for the Republic in general in the aftermath of it. So, towards his later life, he kept trying to retire, but he kept getting called back out of retirement. First to serve as Supreme Commander during the Yuzon Vong War, then to serve as the Supreme Commander on a number of other incidents during crises. And even when he was in retirement, the Council of Moffs didn't really do anything without asking him. Around this time period, he adopted the hobby of gardening, which I guess is kind of his own version of Thrawn and art. So his gardens would eventually become a historical landmark, and the Fel Emperors would go to his gardens to meditate, which is pretty badass. So here's his quote about it. Every ruler should have a garden. It's always useful to draw lessons from nature. Leia said, responded with true. From a garden one learns to call the weak and unfit, and to encourage the strong and the vigorous. And the inferior bud soon feels the strength of my pinch. And you make the plants grow in rows. Each receives its proper allotment of space and sunlight and no more. That's fair, don't you think? Which was his thoughts on the matter. So let me see here if there's a picture of him in his garden. So that was it's interesting. I wonder if that was a reference to what's his name, Diocletian, because Diocletian had a garden that after he retired. So yeah, there's his garden, and his garden would eventually become a historical landmark. And after his death, Dala commemorated it on his 93rd birthday. So that was kind of towards the end of his life. Let me find that. Let's see here. Pellaeon was named after Peleus, an idealistic young knight in the King Arthur mythos, which I think describes him fairly well. Let's see here. What am I looking for? Legacy. While he always loved war and battle, he despised the horrors of it. It's kind of like what General Lee said. It's well that war is so terrible that we might grow fond of it. So near the end of his life, this is what he stated. I'm too old to want glory. At my age, you're more worried about what might be said about you after you're dead. I would like to be recalled as an admiral who left the galaxy a little tidier and quieter than he found it. Which I think kind of sums up his entire career. Ultimately, he didn't really have a desire for greatness and to be like Palpatine or even Thrawn. He just wanted to serve as best as he could to the fullness of his abilities. I think that's what made him such a great head of state, was his lack of grandiosity. You'd never see him doing something like building the Death Star or building like planet-sized ships or any of these super products. He'd probably rather give the money to infrastructure projects or a tax cut or something. So let's see. So yeah, the Pellaeon Gardens, the personal gardens. He enjoyed trimming the plants and keeping them orderly, using them as a euphemism for the New Order. However, following the end of the Vuzon Wong War, he returned to his gardens and allowed a small measure of anarchy to creep into it. The Pellaeon Gardens were dedicated on what would have been Pellaeon's 93rd birthday. So they, by 140 ABY, they were still taken care of and had become a national historical landmark, which is pretty cool. So how did Pellaeon die? Well, it's an era I haven't really read much about, but basically when the Second Galactic Civil War happened, Han Solo and Leia's son, Jason Solo, had basically taken charge and was kind of becoming the new Palpatine. He eventually would go on to be known as Darth Caedus and be a sociopath. So I think what happened was there's the Battle of Fondor. I don't really want to go into the details of it because it doesn't really I don't really understand this time period. But basically, Fondor surrendered, and he ordered the Imperial Remnant forces to stand down. But Jason Solo was determined to glass the planet, and Pellaeon refused to take part in it. And as they continued to shoot the civilians, he ordered his side to enter in and protect the civilians. So as that was happening, he retired to speak with Dala, who he thought he was around, but one of Jason Solo's agents followed him. So I'm just going to read this. She begged him to aid Solo, but he refused. She drew a blaster on him, but he still protested that he wouldn't commit genocide against civilians. Pellaeon realized she would shoot him if he did not give in, but refused to bow to pressure. Instead, he realized he had the opportunity to choose how he would die. He ordered his fleet to engage Solo over the comlink and protect the civilians, forcing her to shoot him. So it's pretty telling that was how he chose to die. If anything, that was probably the best way he could have. He got to live to be 92, and he got to die doing what he loved in battle, dying for a morally virtuous point, for kind of the idealism that he kind of championed throughout his life. So it's kind of you gotta, as I said, you gotta be a badass to be assassinated during battle at the age of 92. That people still think you're that much of a that you're still that much of a threat. But no, it's a glorious end for a glorious man. So in the aftermath of Pellaeon, the Fel Empire that followed him would directly take his example of mixing the New Order. Well, their ideology was the New Order with the human face, and they'd keep the ordered part, the hierarchy, to a certain extent, the human centrism, but they ended a lot of the totalitarian aspects of it. They brought a lot more justice, and I guess kind of participation of the average person. The corruption was dramatically repressed, and the focus was on ordered good government and pragmatism, as opposed to kind of power-grabbing hostility. I'll have to do one on the Fel Empire at some point, but it's arguably the greatest system to emerge within the Star Wars universe. It was a pretty even synthesis of the New Republic and the Empire. But eventually the Fel Empire would go on to become the dominant galactic power again. And that was his legacy. He led the Empire back from the brink of complete collapse to becoming the main galactic power once again. He was a man who never wanted command, but when it was finally passed to him, he did what even his hero could not do. So to end off this profile, it's been a long road, sir. Long and hard and discouraging for all of us, but mostly for you. And there's just one other quote I want to read. You may win the occasional battle against this Vorik, but the Empire will always strike back.